I'm Scott Campbell. I teach urban planning here in the Taubman College. I've been here long enough to remember this space. There used to be a basketball court pretty much underneath where you are now, so things have changed. Just a little bit of a heads up of where we are. There are 3 sessions this afternoon. This is the second session, which I'll introduce in a moment. We have a third session at 4:15, and yes, between this session, which will end at 4, there'll be another coffee break. And you might even go outside and enjoy that rare Michigan sunshine. And then there'll be a short break, and then I know we're all looking forward to our keynote speaker, Matthew Gandy, who's flown from London or Cambridge, at 6 o'clock. And just to encourage you to stay around and linger afterwards, there will be a closing reception downstairs. So take these cubist circular steps down to the first floor after the talk. Let me set this up a little bit, make a few introductory comments. First of all, if you have the program, I have to let you know of one minor and one major change. The minor change is that Krista Reicher's colleague Nicole Maurer, I think, is ill and could not come. But I know that session, that presentation's in capable hands with Krista. So she'll begin, and then the second presentation will be by Mona El Kafif and Ali Fard, both from UVA. Unfortunately, our third presenter, Wang Lin from the School of Design in Shanghai, due to the current coronavirus issue and travel complications, was not able to join us. So I'm sorry for that, but it does mean that our presenters have a little more flexibility, although I guess our timekeeper might still run a tight ship, and more importantly, more time for you. And if you like the small chat and then 3 questions system, we can continue that. So, on to today's discussion. So this session is called Global Neo Regionalisms, and if the term regionalism is not opaque enough, we will throw the word neo on it just to complicate things further. So what is neo-regionalisms? I think sometimes it's a regionalism. It means somehow we kind of like the word, but it is changing, and so hopefully they will help us define it. So let me just say a few things to set the scene about regionalism and then turn it over to our panels. I think one of the enduring powers of regionalism, you might call it the Goldilocks Effect. The locality is too small and fragmented, but the nation is too large and unresponsive, so somehow the region is that kind of middle bowl of porridge, just right. I think one of the other powers of regions is it tends to cut across traditional city, state, and in the case of Europe, national boundaries. That not only means that intergovernmental cooperation is inherently built into regionalism, which often means that intergovernmental tension and conflict is built into it, but it also means we tend to be freed from the old assumptions and truisms tied to old boundaries on overly familiar maps. And I think one of the power of the regional approach is they tend to put up different kinds of maps and get us to look at things at a different kind of scale. I think one question for us is the region still a relevant scale of analysis, a scale of governance, a scale of planning and design, and a scale of community? Angela Dillard this morning asked the question, where are the people? And I think an interesting question is, if communities are composed of people, to what extent does the regional scale help us see that? We know the arguments for regionalism, that things tend to spill across local borders. Pollution spills across local borders, water, traffic, labor markets, housing markets. So planning should happen at the scale of the functional city, which is essentially the region, if not the mega-region. We will often argue that the region is the eco-region, the best scale to not only manage resources, but also, in the case of the Ruhr example, or the industrial Midwest, when industries are built around regional resources like coal, the regional scale is the best for it as well. But we also know the downsides of regionalism as well, particularly in this country, that we have weak to no authority at the regional scale. I think that sometimes suggests the power of regionalism for scholars in the United States is that the appeal of regionalism is the path not taken. And it's always tempting for us to say, had we done more regional planning, we wouldn't be in the mess we are today. And finally, one other thought about regionalism, and perhaps this is a difference that we'll see between our examples in the US and in Germany. At least in the US, gaps in wealth, income, public services, education, access to nature, proximity to toxins vary dramatically within regions, often city-suburb. In fact, if you want to understand if someone is rich or poor, it is no longer do you live in the industrial north or the rural south, those boundaries have blurred, but rather where you tend to live in the region. For us, which side of 8 Mile. So for us, at least in the US, an interesting question, for Germany, the region remains a powerful framework to engage inequality. And with those introductory remarks, I would like to invite Krista for our first of 2 presentations.
Okay. Is this further? Okay. So, good afternoon. Let me start with a personal remark. So, after working more than 2 decades in the Ruhr region, and knowing there nearly every mayor and every head of the planning municipality, I was asked to go to another university, to the RWTH Aachen, a small city with no problem from looking from outside, and I asked myself, could I leave such a really interesting region, which had done such really discussable approaches and projects during the last, let's say, 30 years? Yeah, at the end, I decided to move to another area. And when I have taken this decision, some months later, there was an important political decision to stop the coal production in the area close to Aachen. And then, with all these problems and challenges in my mind, I thought this would be a good experience area for the next years. So, this is one of the personal remarks. The second remark is I don't want to present a project which is running for several years, but is a project which has just started with the name LAW, Laboratory for European Augmented Urbanism. And I want to give you a kind of inside view on what we are thinking and what is the attempt to deal with this new cross-border region. So I'm focusing on my presentation on three national agglomeration in the center of Europe at the border between Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. From the city of Aachen, you can move to the next country in, let's say, 5 minutes by car, or at some sites you can see the Netherlands or Belgium. So it is just a three-national agglomeration, and there are several rivers like the Meuse and the Rhine which are structuring this region. So I have the feeling that this region is really, in comparison to others, a unique region in many respects. It is located in one of the most important cross-border regions in Europe, and it forms a central international region where knowledge, where technology and services from the different countries come together, and where the big university, which is also acting in a cross-border manner. So the Netherlands and Germany are facing are faced by different challenges. On the local level, this means the process of transformation on the national level, but also on the global level, the topic of climate change and energy transition is really one of the most discussed topics. And also the question how to strengthen mobility and the infrastructure between the countries and supporting health and housing are in our daily discussion. So, but the question is, when a new political decision with new standards, announced standards like energy transmission is announced, what does this mean for developing a cross-border region? And on the one hand, I'm focusing a little bit on the working methods, the process of developing plans, the planning strategy, and on the other hand, I'm focusing on the process, the product itself, so the idea what should be the result after, let's say, 20 years in managing this process. So we call our laboratory LO because it is located, as you can see here, between two rivers. You know, l'eau is the French name for water. So we are searching for a name, and then we identified this as a name which could work in our approach and in our research and in our planning effort. And I would announce that it is not only a research project, because it's also linked from our university institute to planning offices, my own planning office and the planning office of Maurer Uniteds. So when you see plans, these plans are not done by our institute, because in Germany we are not allowed to design plans in our institute according to our chamber law of the architectural administration. So, and therefore, I think that one of the main efforts would be to link planning and research stronger and to overcome these kind of existing rules. So, law is concentrated on three sub areas in the context of the three national area. The one area is called Metropolis Cologne-Bonn. And for this metropolis, I worked during the last 3 years on an agglomeration concept. It is the first agglomeration concept in Germany, according to a blueprint which has been developed in Switzerland. In Switzerland, this kind of agglomeration concept is a normal concept for the whole country, and it is funded by the state. In Germany, it's the first experience to work on this agglomeration scale. Then it's the Rheinische Revier in the middle. It is characterized by an open cast mining and is currently discussed as the largest landscape construction site in Europe. And I will show you some images and photos which will illustrate this topic. And this transformation process started 1.5 years ago by the political decision to stop the coal production and to make this region a kind of showcase for a pilot region for CO2-free region, the first region in Europe, or perhaps some are talking about the first region in the whole world. I'm not sure if this is true, but this is, let's say, the ambitious announcement in the public. So, and my institute was asked by the Ministry of Economics, not the Ministry of Planning, to develop for the next 3 years a kind of strategy how to develop the spatial transformation of this old industrial area into a sustainable model region. So the question is how to structure the process that at the end, this kind of blueprint can function for other regions. And after this period of 3 years, there will be the question, is this structure or this process or process design so successful that we would announce the first international and technology exhibition in Germany? You know, the building exhibition is a known format, but now with this new area, with this new approach, the political question is this structure as good that we can announce the first building exhibition which is linked to technology? So I don't know how it works. It just started 2 months ago, and we are in the beginning of structuring this process. And the third area is the South Limburg area in the Netherlands. And this area already did a lot of steps to develop this former coal and steel industrialized area into a new landscape. So, and law is a kind, and this I want to explain, a kind of bigger framework to link the activities and to look how the different areas and the strategies can fit together and how to develop the kind of bigger picture. So this was just my short remark to introduce what is going on and what are we doing now in this project. So first of all, I want to focus a little bit on the Cologne-Bonn metropolitan region. Then I shift to the Rheinische Revier, and at the end I will explain a little bit the metropolitan or regio Maas-Rhine development, and then I will come to some conclusions. So about 3 years ago, the question in North Rhine-Westphalia was how to solve the problem of housing shortage in the bigger metropolitan areas, in the bigger cities like Cologne, like Bonn, and like Düsseldorf. And the head of the institution who is responsible for Köln-Bonn said, let's try to follow this model of our colleagues in the Switzerland, and let's try to make a concept which can, at the end, succeed in the question how to balance the different needs of a whole region. You know, when you look on Cologne, it is not one region. It has, let's say, different areas with different architecture, a lot of industrial production, and so on. When you go in detail, you see the urban tissue looking at the River Rhine in Cologne. But you also see at the borders of Cologne spreading industrial areas where the question is, what's the future of these industrial sites? And you see that the traffic mobility is coming to an end. We have a lot of traffic infrastructure, but when you go in the morning from Cologne to Dortmund or from Cologne to Bonn, it takes you really a lot of time by using this traffic infrastructure. So the question was how to balance the need of these two cities in relation to the surrounding and to the hinterland. So when we started this process, the first step we did, we discussed the process design, because the process design is one of the main things in being successful in such a regional development strategy. And what you can see here, these are 3 phases of the process. So the first phase was a kind of diagnosis, what is existing in the region, what are the needs. So we did a lot of workshops, for example, announcing the green and blue infrastructure, invited those people who are working in the municipalities, the experts of the region to discuss what are the needs of this issue, and the same we did in the field of mobility and climate change and ecological issues. So the first step was, and I announced it with the word diagnosis, and then the second step, or the second phases, was a kind of an evaluation of spatial scenarios. And then we decided to invite 4 planning offices to develop scenarios which create a discussion within the region. Because when we, as planners, announce you should go this way or that way, and you develop different scenarios, it is not as helpfully and successful as if you invite planners from the foreign countries which have a completely different view on the region. So, and we explained the region, we explained our diagnosis and said to the planners, so develop extreme scenarios to discuss the different ways to develop this agglomeration Köln-Bonn. And the third phase was to bring all the stuff, all the common things together and to develop one plan. So what we did, 5 minutes, I thought I can have a little bit longer time. Okay, so then it was a misunderstanding, so I have to hurry. Okay, so what we did is, coming back to participation, my feeling is that on the regional scale, you cannot participate the people. You have to participate the stakeholders, the institutions, the expert. And afterwards, as we did it here, we did big workshops, presentations with hundreds of people, and we did discussions with smaller groups to come to conclusions. So, but we did not discuss it with the normal people because this was at that moment not successful. And at the end, we developed a kind of agglomeration plan, and I want to show you some slides what we did. So we identified that there is a conflict between settlement development and the development of the landscape. So, and at the end, we designed different plans, a settlement plan, an economic plan. Economic plan means further areas for economic development or free spaces, landscape, environmental plan, traffic plan, and a kind of model, overall model, how this region should develop. And then we developed some qualified aspects to implement these strategies, and at the end we have this overall plan. I want to show it in this way. So at the end we have this plan, and the next step of this plan, this kind of first agglomeration concept, is that it is transferred into an agglomeration program. The main projects are identified, and with public and private money, the first projects are implemented now. And in this case, in this next phases, the local people are involved, but not before, because this would be a never-ending story to involve 3 million people in this process of a regional concept. So now I come to the Rheinische Revier. The Rheinische Revier, as I said, is the big open cast mining area, but when you look at this map, you don't see one region. You see a lot of managements, but in total, in the bigger picture, this is a region with big transformation areas. All these areas which are green are transformation areas, and what you can also see is that by the coal and by the coal production, a lot of villages has to be shifted to another place, and even the motorway was shifted to another place to take the coal out of the ground. So in this case, you see the power of the industry and the energy production in this area. And the question now is, what does it mean, the aspect of energy transition for such a reason which has suffered a lot under this kind of industrial past? 10 years ago, the first signs of dealing with, in the field of architecture with this kind of landscape were established. This is a well-known building called the building Man in the Land, a walkable sculpture to observe the whole process of change in the region. And this was a first sign, a new spectacular architecture at a former brownfield. And now new pictures are appearing because one of the main ideas is to establish in this area the biggest lake district of Germany in all these big holes. But the decision is not at all taken, so it's a process we are now starting with the different communities and to structure. But the question is how to link this agglomeration concept to this Rheinische Revier, because in the agglomeration concept, we had a lot of connections to the Rheinische Revier, and now we have to look on the bigger picture. So the third area is the Dutch side, the southern part of Limburg. And when you look at this area, where we started this kind of mapping, we see that this area is a kind of enclave in the Netherlands, but regarding the topography, the structure, it's really closely linked to Germany and to Belgium. Now I want to show why it is important to use pictures in this discussion with people, with stakeholders. So for us, it was really fascinating to look at this map, the metro map of Greater London. And this was created by Henry Beck. He was an engineer and worked in the London Metropolitan Institution. And in his leisure time, he drew a map, a kind of map where you see the real electrical network on the left, which was then transferred into this kind of technical stuff. So, and what is really interesting by using this kind of metaphor is that then we thought, what does this mean, this kind of map transferring to this region? And now we put this map into the Meuse-Rhine region, and suddenly, it's a design 1-to-1, it's the same scale. Then people started to discuss, what does this mean? At the moment, we have only bad connections between Aachen and Maastricht and Kerkrade. What does it mean to have such a metro system in our region? So this simple picture or this simple map shows you how this connectivity can be worked in the next steps. It's not realistic at the moment, but we want to strengthen this kind of thinking. So, and another point is that in this area, the Parkstadt Limburg, it's a part of the southern Limburg, the first international building exhibition according to the German model is now established, and this year in summer there will be the first presentation of the result. My feeling is that the efforts are not really impressing, but it is interesting to see that one of the main messages is that the next phases of planning will be a cross-border activity. That means for us it is really important to look on the different layers of this region, to identify the different languages, the different conditions of climate change, and to look how things fit together and come to a new approach of planning. So we discussed it this afternoon and in the morning, the role of mapping. My impression is that in relation to the stakeholders, the politicians, and also with a broader public authority, it's really impressive to use these kind of maps and to show what is going on as a kind of layer in the field of diagnosis for the next step. So our idea is to bring the different areas together and to create one strategy for the different authorities, because the three areas are financed by different institutions, and the law project is financed by the government of the Netherlands and not from the German part. My conclusion is, regarding the agglomeration concept, that we are, let's say, now in a role to discuss more and more not only about shrinking, about metropolitan and rural area, but to discuss about a polycentric region. And to establish this model, we started in the agglomeration concept in Köln-Bonn, now to develop it to the Rheinische Revier and to the other Netherlands part. And I ask myself, what does this mean in the sense of scale and in the sense of quality? And the second conclusion is that we need more regional and more multi-dimensional urban design and development strategies, and that we have to overcome the borders. Several weeks ago, the discussion was started to apply, that Germany would apply for the Olympic Games in 2034. And they were not speaking about the Ruhr region. They are not speaking about the Rheinische Revier. We are speaking about a new kind of metropolitan area called Rhine-Ruhr Olympic City. So we have to overcome the borders of the regional thinking and to look for measures and for strategies to design this kind of thinking. And my last point is that design thinking and design mapping is a basis for convincing concepts and this is my central point, for decision making. So the making the region, making the city is one of our main challenges, and we have to deal with new pictures, with new strategies in designing this, because then we can strengthen the discussion and we can hopefully change something. Thank you.
All right. I think our personal mics are on, right? So we can kind of move around. We have the kind of somewhat awkward task of presenting. It's two people, but I think we'll manage. So good afternoon. My name is Ali Fard from UVA, and
I'm Mona El Kafif, also from UVA. And maybe to give you a little bit of a background how this project evolved. Within the context of the Urban Seminar Foundation grant that we all, gave us the opportunity to all work together in the recent months, Ali and I actually decided to start a new research project. The research that you are going to see tonight or this afternoon is going to be the foundation for our new upcoming urban design program, and will serve as a, let's say, a base research to nurture a series of foundation studios in the first seminar. So when I compare this, for example, with the work that we saw earlier today in relationship to Detroit, there was this quote about the diagram, and we are literally in the stage of drawing the diagram in order to understand the region and to use this as a starting point for a series of design research projects.
So just to initially give you a sense of what the project is all about, we're going to kind of present the abstract of the whole project and then kind of contextualize it through a series of maps, found images, and then onto some of our analytic material. So we're focusing on the area called Hampton Roads Metropolitan Region, which is in the southeastern Virginia, located at the southern extension of northeastern Seaboard. We're kind of looking at it as a prototype to explore a regional approach to strategic reuse of underutilized urban spaces or land resources through a process which we're calling recommissioning land. Different land resources such as federally owned military land, city and state owned vacant land, as well as industrial and infrastructural right-of-way land are stitched together into a regional catalog of otherwise disconnected sites.
Maybe to start our work, I want to bring us all back to the mother, or let's say the grandmother of all regions. We are going to get you back to the 50s, and we are at the northeastern Seaboard, which was basically a region that was identified by John Gottman, who on the basis of the new census prepared a map which showed the continuity of an area from north of Boston to south of Washington. This was Gottman's first statistical demonstration showing a continuous stretch of urban and suburban areas, which the main axis consisted of 600 miles. And just giving you an example in comparison to the Ruhr area, it's at least 15 times the long extension of the Ruhr area. This new founded geography was at this time a phenomenon that was unique, not only in the US, but also in the whole world, and the Great Lake region followed afterwards and was basically coined a couple of years afterwards. It's resulted from urban growth of a chain of metropolitan areas, each of which were basically around a substantial urban nucleus, but they were also linked by infrastructure, railway lines, as well as the US 1, which created a chain of urban centers that, because of their proximity to each other, had an incredible economic competition which caused the growth along the northeastern Seaboard. Oh, sorry, I have to. John Gottman coined this area megalopolis, as we all know, in his book that was published in 1961. And at different periods, the main weight of the northeastern interest oscillated from the sea trade to continental development. And with this, megalopolis growth represents, until today, the economic history of the United States and was described as the urban hinge of the American economy. As the nation's growth center, this area concentrated on manufacturing industry, education, cultural production, financial centers, and port activities. The aggregation of wealth as a spring-off of these economical aspects and a society really promoting individual lifestyle generated an unprecedented growth along the edge. If you look today at the urban territories that megalopolis produced, you can basically also follow Gottman's final findings in his study that puts effort into the analysis of land use, showing also very hybrid lands within the megalopolis and in between spaces, where, for example, agriculture can't be compared with a traditional rural-urban divide. This hybrid growth continued until today, and we have today a landscape of big box industries, portland, suburban settlements, and large-scale infrastructures. Today, the region is defined still by growth. It's one of the 11 megaregions in the US, and despite only covering 2% of the nation's land area, it's producing 20% of the country's GDP. And it's also going until 2050, which is the deadline for growth basically in the mega region, going to add another 30 million inhabitants. Changing patterns in global industry, Changing patterns in global industry, however, really created a paradigm shift in relationship to the industry and the infrastructural development, which caused a lot of leftover land also in form of brownfields. And we looked, for example, in these maps, we can see here the analysis of the northeastern seaboard, as well as the first subshed that we looked at, which is the Chesapeake watershed that branches down to the entrance of the James River mouth in the Atlantic. And we looked primarily at the EPA-designated brownfields and Superfund sites, and this was our first approach to look at leftover post-industrial lands. Understanding the regional effects of climate change and rising sea level specifically, our research has adopted a telescopic watershed scale and analytical lens. Initially, we focused on the Chesapeake Bay, but also very quickly understood that this is still a gigantic region, and zoomed into the Elizabeth River watershed, which is further south in the Hampton Road area. And we understand this as a prototypical site for the exploration of strategies that would be applicable potentially to other sites within the northeastern seaboard. Our first attempt to develop an inventory of available underutilized brownfield sites, however, showed very quickly we were forced to have a shift in our strategy, as once we landed on ground, literally, it was clear that the brownfield sites are very dirty data, if I want to call it like this, because they don't update the data. Some of the areas had been developed, others not. But we also discovered a whole new category or new categories of available lands that we could work with.
So we thought first we'll give you a kind of historical context in terms of how Hampton Roads has developed, its kind of geographic and geological conditions, because they form an important context of how we're approaching and strategizing about the region as a whole. So Hampton Roads is both a land area, but it's also a body of water. So both this body of water here is called Hampton Roads, but also the kind of larger land area that surrounds it. The water body is one of the world's largest natural harbors. The term roads, which is a shorthand for roadstead, indicates a safety of a port, designating a partly sheltered area of water near shore in which vessels may ride at anchor. And it's kind of interesting or funny to call it a natural harbor, even though it might have historically been naturally formed. Currently, a lot of dredging happens to maintain the kind of naturalness or the usability of the port and the kind of water bodies that are surrounding it. The land area that is called Hampton Roads includes a collection of cities, counties, and towns on the Virginia Peninsula. The word Hampton itself honors one of the founders of the Virginia Company of London, which was a great supporter of the colonization of Virginia by the British. So the etymology of the place is both geographic as well as political, which kind of hints at the so-called complicated history of the area. But in general, the harbor was the key, was the main key to Hampton Roads' growth. So the area's growth and development have been intricately tied and aligned with its water bodies. And as mentioned before, Hampton Roads is among the world's largest natural harbors. It is the northmost major East Coast port of the United States, which is ice-free throughout the year. And US Navy realized this early on, the ideal conditions of the harbor. And beginning in 1970s, huge Navy bases and military developments began to spring up in the area in response to World War I efforts. Sewell Point, which is at the northeastern part of Norfolk, began to be developed as the largest naval base in the world at the time, which was established by the United States Navy and is now known as the Naval Station Norfolk. Military developments in the area followed and have led to a lot of hard edges, impervious surfaces, and have heavily contributed to the environmental degradation of the sensitive coastal zones. Not to mention, on the social side of things, the displacement of many people, mostly African Americans, which is something that needs to be considered if we are going to be reimagining the future of these spaces, the kind of power dynamics that enact on that space and over land. These conditions are further exacerbated by the very geological formation of the area, and we're kind of taking a deep dive into history here. 35.5 million years ago, bolide impacted the area, centered right at Cape Charles, right there, at the northern point of Hampton Roads. The continual slumping of the rubble within the crater that was caused by the impact has affected the flow of the rivers and has shaped the shape and conditions of Chesapeake Bay. The impact crater created a long-lasting topographic depression which helped determine the course of the local rivers, including James River and Elizabeth River, and the eventual location of Chesapeake Bay itself. The impact also disrupted aquifers. The present freshwater aquifers lie above a deep salty brine lake underground, which makes the area in lower Chesapeake Bay very much susceptible to groundwater contamination. The crater is also one of the major factors contributing to the sinking of land in the area. For example, Hampton Roads, the area that we're looking at, is gradually sinking at a rate of 5 to 7.5 inches per century, which might not sound like much, but that's the highest rate on the Atlantic coast. So this geological condition and the various rounds of industrial and militaristic developments in the area have created a perfect storm of sorts, especially when it comes to climate change and responses to rising sea levels. The Hampton Roads area has the largest concentration of military bases and facilities of any metropolitan area in the world. Nearly 1/4 of the nation's active duty military personnel are stationed in Hampton Roads. And almost 80% of the region's economy is very much derived from federal sources. This includes the large military presence, but also facilities related to NASA and departments of energy, transportation, and commerce. While these developments have created a strategic relationship with marine transportation and water, the threat of sea level rise due to climate change has exacerbated the need to rethink the relationship of the region to its waterways and water bodies, specifically because the industrial and military history of the area has contributed heavily to the contamination of the water and the soil, which will eventually be inundated due to sea level rise. And just to give you some sort of an administrative context, we're really dealing with, within our study area, we're dealing with 4 different municipalities, which again complicate things when you're trying to create a regional framework and think regionally. And while the Elizabeth River watershed is 90% developed, the case of Norfolk is a little bit higher, it's 95% developed. These territories are increasingly at risk of flooding due to the nature of their construction, which is again dominated by hard edges and impermeable surfaces. Given the scale of development in the region, underutilized urban spaces and formal industrial lands will need to play a much more critical role in addressing the threat of sea level rise and to reorient the regional relationship to water in how we begin to work with water as opposed to against it.
Maybe.
How do you
Maybe before we continue, it's really important to look at the flood scenario. So we are talking about the next 60 to 70 years, where Norfolk is going to be flooded, including the other cities around it. So there is, interestingly enough, if we quickly talk about our method, so we introduced the idea of scaling down, but to really consider this in form of sheds, primarily also the water flow sheds, as I think it was said now multiple times, water doesn't respect any form of political boundaries. But we also extended our definition of underutilized spaces. So from the former brownfield, we moved ahead and had a look at different property attributes. We specifically looked at, because private property is so hard to handle in this country, we looked at the opportunity to work with public land, city-owned land, state-owned land, as federally owned, and specifically the land that is occupied by the Navy. And we also differentiated between different kinds of land uses, so industrial, but then also currently industrial land that might be future vacant land in the future, as well as open land that is zoned but not yet occupied. To give you a little bit of an idea, we mentioned earlier that the region is characterized by heavy infrastructure, and you saw the pictures of literally the roads going under the water, being flooded on a regular basis. Actually, rain floods are caused in Norfolk in the summer region time at least every 2 or 3 weeks. So it's a daily or a weekly scenario in some seasons. So we looked at these infrastructures, and you can see here a beltway that basically goes around all of the 4 cities that we were investigating, which goes at the edge like a belt road. And then there's a series of train tracks that go into the nucleus of the larger region. And these are primarily used for industrial freight cargo, so it's not person traffic, which also means when there's a shift in industry, these train tracks might have different functions in the future. So there are obviously, as you can imagine, we are not hired yet by the ministry like Krista, but we hope that we are going to get the job in the future, because you can see that there are a lot of activities happening, specifically coming from the city of Norfolk. Norfolk is actually sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation. They have a resilience officer, Kyle Spencer. We were in a lot of discussions with him. He's very excited that we are taking this on now on a regional scale. They are working on their 10 brownfield sites that they are reappropriating for resilience strategies. Kate Orff is working with them on the Ohio River. We have in the north, in Hampton, the Dutch dialogues, because every time when you're in danger of being flooded, you are inviting the Dutch engineers, as they know how to handle the problem. There are a lot of activities that also happen on an economic or academic level. For example, Penn Design looked at areas in Norfolk, a kind of industrial zone where coal is currently transported, and they were comparing these sites with areas up north and northeast and Seaboard, but there is no regional strategy that exists at the moment. There's also a bottom-up idea of flood protection specifically, where smaller projects are initiated across the field. And these projects, which is very exciting, there's a new non-profit government-funded initiative called RISE. And RISE is paying for neighborhoods and NGOs to initiate flood protection projects in the height of $250,000. So in the moment when there is a plan, there's also financial support to realize this. However, what is missing is the regional spatio-temporal strategy that connects these efforts and literally the dots on the map. Despite being more complex due to land ownership questions and administrative boundaries, a regional move will be ultimately very necessary, a necessary step in dealing with the multiscalar effects of rising sea levels. This will entail the coordination of multiple municipalities and other actors involved in resilient efforts and in the region. And we believe this is also a beautiful topic for a mayor's institute, obviously. To do this, Recommissioning Land proposes a land assembly strategy that will stitch together adjacent but otherwise disconnected parcels, including brownfield Superfund sites, military and vacant land, major transportation corridors, and also impermeable surfaces such as parking lots and industrial zones. We also adjusted the lands according to the land ownership and now are differentiating between city-owned, state-owned, federal-owned land. And these generated a catalog of large-scale operational high-potential sites, we believe and hope. The Hampton Roads Beltway operates as an infrastructural armature or a spine of these sites by infrastructurally organizing and connecting these assembled sites to each other. The next step in the study is to typologically categorize these sites as pilot sites and to select a few of them for further exploration. And this is just once more zooming into the land use catalog, and you can see that the military land has an incredible footprint within these land zones. And I'm now seeing Julie sitting at the end. Julie was very helpful in advising us on a regular basis, and she always said, you have to talk to the military because they are obviously there to protect land, but also to probably have a defense land in relationship to the water. Here we see our attempt to break down the scale of the original region and to identify pilot typologies and pilot sites. They are repetitive across the region. So we have exports, we have gates, we have intersects, we have inlets, and we have thoroughfares. And we analyze these now in a kind of inventory.
Yeah, and so just to go a little bit into some of the analytical work that forms the basis of our site aggregation strategy, I'll introduce a few of these pilot sites, or pilot site typologies, I should say. First, we have intersect, which is really kind of identified as the point of intersection, as you would guess, of a number of major infrastructural lines. In this case, a major freight rail line that delivers coal to one of the ports in Norfolk. That is then, the coal is delivered via ship to China. And the beltway itself, which, as Mona mentioned, forms the armature of our site aggregation strategy. And so even though at each of these sites, the type of lands that is available to us, or we're kind of the type of lands that we're looking opportunistically at are different, nonetheless, there is an available series of lands. So the percentages will change, the type of lands will change, but the strategy remains the same. The idea is to assemble all these together to produce this kind of larger scale, more impactful areas of intervention. In this case specifically, we see that transportation infrastructure, especially leftover lands related to transportation infrastructure, so these are the kind of the clover fields around highways, the right-of-way land along the railways, and so on, form the major part of this site typology, to be exact, 51%. Another 36%, which is the kind of the brownish color, is 1 minute. I'll run fast. Is vacant land, and most of this vacant land is actually publicly owned, divided between city, federal, and state. So these are just, I'll run through these, some of the kind of conditions that will come across on the Beltway. And it's really interesting to see the effects of inundation. The sea rise already is influencing how this space is organized or disorganized. In this case, major electricity lines are going to be inundated within the space of weeks, potentially. Again, some of the leftover land along the highway, along the railway. This is another pilot site typology called the Inlet, where the inlets of the river begin to intersect with major urban areas and the Beltway itself. In this example, industrial land is really the largest chunk of land that we think, once decommissioned, again, once those industries begin to move out of the area, which is very much likely to happen, it presents an opportunity to kind of assemble those together. The second largest is vacant lands. Again, this is kind of typically the kind of condition that you get once the river begins to interact with some of the urban infrastructures. And finally, another pilot site we're going into is the gate, which are really the moments of entrance and exit into the area. And interestingly here, open space is really the largest portion of land that would be available if we're thinking about this kind of land aggregation strategy.
I promise that we finish in 2 minutes, okay? So these are some shots of the other pilot sites. Very interesting is the export, which is where the train arrives from West Virginia, where the coal is taken out of the ground, causing the highest cancer rate in Virginia. Then it's dumped on these sites, causing another pollution beside an African-American neighborhood in Newport News, and then shipped to China and India. So these are areas where the coal gets out of the country because it's not even used in the US, interestingly enough. So we looked at some data. I'm not going to dive deep here. It's just very important to see what's actually the land value and who's owning most of the land. And Norfolk is the strongest city within the land aggregation strategy, specifically because they also own the airport, the international airport that is very close to the water, the rising water area. We thought we are comparing the Rhine Revier with the Hampton Road area just to get an idea of scale. And you can see that this is to scale as an aerial photograph. And you can see while your water troubles are somewhere else, it's pretty much a similar extent. And we also had the pleasure to look, obviously, at the Loop City, the master plan for the region, Copenhagen and Sweden, and this is also to scale, just to give us an idea that these projects are possible. And the similarity here is also that the regional strategy is attached to the infrastructure that facilitates mobility, but becomes in the future, hopefully, a multifunctional infrastructure, which means we are also looking at industry, economy, waste recycling, food production, etc. And our idea here, and if you remember maybe the original flood map, flooding obviously occurs within the watershed of the Elizabeth River. It's really important that we are not saying we shouldn't look at the inlets inside, so activity is already going on. But the outer rim is an incredible potential to actually create higher density on higher ground because the area is still growing, and the way how it's growing at the moment is very unsustainable. So just simply to wrap up, this is the last slide. In the context of planetary scale climate change and sea level rise, the coastal nature of the majority of urban centers in the northeastern seaboard has necessitated the rearticulation of the process and forms of urbanization and reimagination of their relationship to water and climatic events. Underutilized spaces throughout the Elizabeth River watershed might be the starting point of transformative urban design strategies that create an adaptive response to water. The aim is to make a strong case, both economically and environmentally, for the need for this watershed scale effort. Hampton Roads is a framework for future work, as we already mentioned, and we are really looking forward to investigate this in detail with close collaboration with the city administrators and specifically with Kyle Spencer from Norfolk. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both our presenters. Thank you to our timekeeper. And we're doing fine. It's 3:34, and we will stop at 4. So let me make just a few comments to try to kind of set the stage, and then we will open it up. And if someone has the catch box, we can play football. Let me just highlight a few things in reverse order, starting with Ali and Mona. But I guess an overall comment, I just have to say what an impressive amount of mapping this all represents, either by you and or assistants and grad students. I'm reminded of the Scottish regional planner, Patrick Geddes, who said survey before plan, and I guess here it's map before plan, or map, and make more maps. First on Ali and Mona, I think what I find fascinating, is one of the things you dealt with too that kind of struck me is just the kind of the understudied role of military in the US landscape, and it's something in a previous lifetime I spent a lot of time looking at. And it's not only a huge part of the economy, but if one of the big challenges is land assembly, that You can do eminent domain, but that's challenging. We often rely on deindustrialization or the movement of shipping to container ports, freeing up places like the New York Harbor or the London Docklands. Often the decommissioning of military bases is a huge place to get land. The San Francisco Presidio is a well-known case, although here it doesn't sound like they are doing that. I'm struck too by your emphasis on the mega-region, and as you nicely point out, John Gottman talked about the first one we identified, the Boston-Washington one now, and I guess it's a question of, do we change our maps of that? Do we extend it north to Portsmouth, if not Portland, Maine, but more importantly, push it down to Richmond and Hampton Roads? I think there's also a sense of, I think you give I really appreciated the late 1800s map of the region of just reminding us what, historically, what a role this place has in the military history. You might say the imperial military history of the United States, which might get threatened. In fact, in a way, defense becomes a dual meaning now. There's both the defense through battleships, destroyers, and aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy, but now perhaps the defense of seawalls, pylons, pumps, and relocation. So the military now has two fronts they have to fight the war on, if not more, and it changes their arsenal. Of course, as a regionalist, I appreciate the regional scale that you do it, and I think one of the things it does across the regional scales is it allows for not only a shared effort in scale economies, but a shared solidarity and often shared political strength through lobbying across the region, because municipalities now share a common threat. I guess the question is, for this region, sometimes a shared threat leads to a shared solidarity, but sometimes it tears a region apart. So I'll be curious to see how that happens. There's much more on that, but in the interest of time, let me then shift to Krista's. And what I enjoy about the work Krista's done is when I first heard Krista speak, she was on the east side of the Rhine, looking at the Ruhr, and now she has crossed the river on the west side of the Rhine. And I guess one question would be, would this kind of regional coordination effort be at all possible without the European Union? I know being here in Detroit, I at least fantasize about what would it be like if we had a kind of Maastricht agreement, a shared currency, and a Schengen agreement between the US and Canada so that we could travel to Windsor easily. And my true fantasy is one day we can take high-speed rail to Toronto, 2 hours to the east, and Chicago 2 hours to the west. One can dream. So though you didn't talk much about it, I'd be curious about just how much the European Union has enabled what you do, both by removing barriers, but also by providing financial incentives. I know that we American regional planners envy the Europeans, both for regulatory and financial possibilities. I'm intrigued by the idea of a carbon dioxide-free region. Let us know when that happens. And I'm curious to, returning to the issue of maps, I think that you return to a kind of a strategy that planners often do, which is to conceptualize the region not only as an agglomeration, sometimes a traditional agglomeration of central city and hinterland like Köln and Bonn and along the Rhine, but also this kind of decentralized polycentric region to the west in the Rheinische Revier. And for those who don't know German, the word Revier, I guess you would translate as area, territory, or region, but perhaps it has its own meaning. But I think there's this common strategy that the way we develop regional planning is not just through institutions, but to develop a regional identity, a sense of a regional community. And often the planner strategy to do that is through, you might say, a layer cake of GIS maps of economy, of open space, traffic, housing, commuting, and so on. And then we aggregate all these things together and say, well, this is the region. It is this kind of overlays of GIS. It certainly works for us. I sometimes wonder if the public, in looking at many different overlays of GIS maps, has the same kind of identification if that's part of their region. a few more comments, and then we'll start throwing the catch box. I love the image of the observation platform, and it seems like that's common. There's the the tetrahedron or whatever in Bottrop. There's a special term for that, and just this idea that you build an observation platform and you go to the top to look at the landscape is in a way of saying not only look, but to say there's something worth looking at. And in fact, there's something new here, that this is not the old industrial region that you knew. It's almost a bit of a tourist gaze. So come and see how it's changed. So I think there's a powerful moment there. And I'm trying to, I thought when we were 2 years ago in Essen at the colliery, the Zollverein, and we're at this lovely observation platform, it had that same effect of come to the top and look at it and see how it's changed. And I wonder, in Detroit, is there any place in Detroit that we can go to and be at top and say, look at how Detroit has changed? So again, it reminds me that much of the task of regionalism is to construct the vision of regionalism, to show the networks, the connectivity, and often the challenge is to get people to identify themselves as regionalism. One might differentiate between the hard regionalism of institutions, which are often made easier if you have the soft regionalism of community identity, which is particularly challenging in a polycentric region. If you're in New York, you know that Manhattan is the center, and by all traveling by bridge and tunnel to New York, there is a sense of solidarity. But in a polycentric region, that challenge is more challenging. And I guess finally, I've often think about just the link between maps and regions. I guess I've been struck by just how many maps we've looked at. And in some ways, perhaps one assumption is to map a place rationally and logically is to assert that a place is also plannable in a rational and a logical kind of way. That in fact, that perhaps a lot of people's assumptions is that a city, and certainly a region, and certainly a mega-region, is far too complex and chaotic to ever really get your hand around it, so we follow an American strategy of everybody on their own. But I think that one of the powers of the map is to at least kind of create a kind of precondition for planning to say, if we can conceptually map it, perhaps we can conceptually plan it. With that, I'd like to invite our three speakers up here, and I think they're all mic'd. And just out of curiosity, do you like the trio of questions strategy? People? No? No, you want something different. Okay. Well, when your associate dean gives a thumbs down, we will defer to Anya. Yes, we just called you out. So, tell you what, save your conversation with your side-by-side people for 4 o'clock when we have a coffee break. We have 15 minutes. And why don't we just jump right into questions? If the three have any initial statements, go for it. Otherwise, I'll toss the box.
I can answer a little bit the question of the European Union.
Okay.
So this agglomeration concept in Köln-Bonn is paid half by the European Union because they want to strengthen these regional approaches, and half of the money is coming from the Ministry of North Rhine-Westphalia. So it's a combination of, let's say, the local ministry, financial things, and the European context. Regarding the law project, it is financed by so-called Regio deal. This means that the Netherlands want to support the border regions and not only focusing with financial support Amsterdam, Den Haag, that means the central area of the country. And this is impressive to see. It's not financed by the European Union, but we have in many of our projects a combination of the local money and the European money. Mm-hmm. And this makes it more easy to deal in this scale and to develop these kind of projects.
Thank you.
Maybe, I mean, we don't have the question of the European Union, obviously. so who
Well, we
knows?
have 4 municipalities.
But I think we intentionally showed one of the very early maps of John Gottman because he extended the mega region down to Virginia. And when you look at the growing patterns and also the ecological sheds, which are the watersheds, the map really has to be redrawn. We believe that the Richmond and Norfolk Hampton Roads area is a part of this extent. To some degree, I mean, we were somehow excited. We always read in all kinds of reports that the sea level is rising faster than in other areas, but we didn't really know why, except that you have a river, and the river goes into the ocean and creates a kind of, it's like water is held back because of the currency. We actually then found the reason that there was this asteroid like 35 million years ago, which creates this unique petri dish to some degree. So I personally very much believe that this is a perfect storm situation, also combined with the Navy, that allows the US to create a real precedent. Rising water is an everyday part of, when you drive to Cape Charles, you actually see the water going into the tunnels and you're afraid of driving down into the tunnel. And it's such a danger to everyone that I believe it will create this moment where we all act together. We have to, because the water is flowing everywhere. And there is a little bit of there are the strong partners like Norfolk, and then there are on the other side the weaker partners where not a lot of stuff is happening at the moment. But we have the big hope that this creates a kind of situation where everyone has to sit around one table.
Thank you.
And to some degree, because Krista mentioned multiple times, we need a new economy. It's a perfect site for the new Green Deal and the new Blue Deal.
All the deals.
All the deals.
Okay. Just one other thing. It's interesting that kind of traditional regionalism, going back to Lewis Mumford and the Tennessee Valley Authority, et cetera, and the New Deal was envisioned kind of regions organized around watersheds. And here water is the uniting factor, but it's not managing too much fresh water, but managing too much salt water.
Hi, Jeff Toon, University of Michigan. Thank you both very much for your presentations. My question has to do with the degree to which, as you formulate the projects, which are occurring in two very different contexts from what I apprehend, like one being commissioned by a state agency ultimately, and the other being a self-initiated project, which is aiming to create its own subject matter and territory, which of course I completely agree with as an approach. To what extent will you tactically utilize communications and branding that is outwardly facing to the public, and at what moments of the project? Because there's a tendency on the one hand in the official project for these kind of communications to occur throughout the duration of the project to build kind of awareness and identity around the efforts, but I'm curious how that's going to work. And in the academic kind of design research model, the tendency is that the communications occur at the end once the project has been produced. But it's not clear to me that that's necessarily the sequence. So I guess it's an aspirational question, maybe for you both, about how central in the developing of the project itself is the act of producing the imaginary of the project for the various publics you're trying to engage.
I think so. For us, it's a little bit early to kind of even think about the kind of public dissemination of the work, because so much of it is analytical at this point, and it's a lot about kind of creating that agency and sense of urgency around the need for this kind of regional thinking, as opposed to each municipality having their own resilience office. There needs to be this kind of beltway kind of initiative almost. And also, it's most of the work is it's going to become the basis of a series of urban design studios that begin to tackle a number of these sites at a finer scale. And I think that would be a really good moment to begin to disseminate the project. But at the same time, we're in contact with some of the officials at the cities. Kyle has been very instrumental in terms of kind of providing data and also kind of showing enthusiasm for that kind of thinking, the regional thinking. So there is interactions, but so far it's been kind of early in the making of the material to kind of publicly disseminate the work.
I mean, I agree. In a classic academic process, you would go ahead, have your 5 studios, have a little publication, invite everyone, have a symposium and all of these things, and in between you're inviting everyone to your reviews. But when I mentioned earlier it's a perfect site for a Mayor's Institute initiative, I was actually serious. And I think we should get funding for this. And once I would love to show this first to Kyle and to say, what do you think? You need always companions in your activities. But once this is settled, and he said, you know what, that's actually really interesting because we already thought about these and these spots, I think we should reach out and try funding that really taps into the political discussion, because I would really like this to be more outside of the academic setting than maybe in the past.
Let me add a comment. I have the feeling that in the German system, the need of linking the outcome out of research projects and the kind of involving stakeholders and municipalities is now really strengthening. In former times, we were asked to produce knowledge, and then this knowledge disappeared somehow. And now when I look on my research projects, there is always a component, what does this mean as a basis for implementation in the next step? And this means that the projects are completely structured in another way. So when I'm starting a research project in 2 weeks, there will be a kind of opening ceremony on the local level, and we have to invite stakeholders which are involved in this process. And this has completely changed. And my experience is every project, even a research project and a design project, needs a clear strategy of communication and of participation, but with a view on those who should be addressed by the project. And my opinion that you cannot really involve the people on the regional level. It's based on the experience, because they are always discussing about the problems of the site. And the other stakeholder says, what are you talking about? I am looking on my side. So you have to look on this kind of communication and participation strategy, and you have to identify the right moment where you link your outcome or your intermediate outcome with the professionals, with the institutions, and at what moment you find the right format to discuss the outcome or the outcome of the diagnosis with the people. But this needs really a strong design, a process design. Otherwise, you will fail in implementing your ideas.
Hi, my question's about Norfolk and Hampton Roads. We're facing serious sea level rise, and most people are in denial and want to defend. The conservative political business people estimate is 2 feet of sea level rise in this century, and I think scientists have a much more a much higher level of scientific knowledge of 10 feet or more easily. And there's a glacier in Antarctica that's about to break loose, and I believe it's supposed to raise, that alone will raise sea level 2 or 3 feet. And I know the military is, and the Navy especially, is very interested in global warming issues in their own thinking and strategy. And 2 or 3 feet of sea level rise would pretty much submerge your area, I believe. And I wondered you didn't mention anything about what's going to happen if sea level rise in that area goes up 6 feet in this century.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When we looked at the sea level rise scenarios, you also, depending on the scenario, it rises much faster than you think. And there are different scientists who think different things. But what is clear, it's going to rise. And I don't know if you try to hint at this, but the current government is not so in support of believing in that this is actually happening. So the military, however, is extremely concerned because they see the water penetrating the property and rising. So they found a loophole in the language, not calling it based on sea level rise and climate change, but permanent flooding, which then released actually funds to support, at least to strengthen the seawalls. So this is how interesting the discussion is, that we have to call this, we have to find new terms, because the political leadership is not believing that this is happening. So in our discussion with Carl Spencer, it was also clear that he said, well, when the wall protection system comes in, the Navy really wants to build at least around Norfolk, which is where most of their property lies. They want to build a seawall protection system. This might delay the scenario of water to come, but what they truly need to learn is how to creatively live together with the water. And he literally said at the moment, when we didn't show the neighborhood maps, when the parcel blocks and the block areas are already elevated because it was an older zoning code that you have to elevate the housing, the residential blocks. So the streets are lower and they are flooding on a regular basis, which is a perfect territory for green infrastructure. There are parks that can absorb water. But at the end of the day, even if your house stays dry, maybe, there will be water as a circulation system and infrastructure because this is going to flood. And at the end of the day, we need to think about how can we live with the water, even if we don't have streets, but maybe channels.
Yeah, and I think that idea of a seawall is interesting because a lot of kind of conditions that we're beginning to respond to are caused by those very much hard edges, right, that try to continually keep water out. And we know that based on this kind of scenarios, the water will penetrate, the water will rise, and it will kind of take its space. So we're continually thinking alternatives to the seawall, right? Kind of giving space to water and then kind of thinking about relocation strategies, potential relocation strategies. Because it's become a fact of life in Norfolk for people. They see the presence of water continually in the tunnels, on the streets, as you saw, around power lines, because of the kind of geology of it, but again, because of this kind of remnant of the industrial and military developments of 20th century, right? It's a systemic failure that we're responding to, hopefully with not another future failure, but something that deals with water in a different way.
Maybe one point that is really important, and Julie can talk about this much more than us, the brownfields that are currently polluted combined with rising sea level and groundwater is going to be the biggest environmental catastrophe that you can imagine for this region. So there's a very important reason why we have to protect these brownfields nearly from flooding. And maybe there a seawall is going to be important because we can't allow the water to go into these brownfield sites before they are remediated. So there's a whole other chapter which is affecting the environment in the future because water and pollution together is never good. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And maybe one strategy is to reside, or at least to reside onto the higher grounds that we were highlighting. Yeah. But even if people are moving away from these sites, we need to protect these brownfield sites from flooding because they will cause a lot of pollution if they are exposed to water.
I wish we had time for more questions and answers, but it is 4 o'clock and I wanted to respect your 15 minutes of coffee time and stretch your legs. So please join me in thanking our 3 presenters. You can ask them more questions during the break.